How the British Empire became the world's biggest narco cartel. There is a portrait hanging in London's National Portrait Gallery that should make your stomach turn. It shows Queen Victoria, draped in silk and jewels, holding the scepter of empire with the serene gaze of a benevolent ruler. The painting radiates dignity and moral authority. But if you could peel back that canvas and look at the financial records of her government in 1839, you would see something very different. You would see the balance sheet of the largest drug cartel in human history. The British Empire did not conquer the world through superior morality or enlightened civilization. It conquered the world because it had better accountants and fewer scruples. And when the ledger started bleeding red in the 1830s, those accountants made a decision that would poison an entire continent. They decided to become drug dealers. This is not a metaphor. This is not an exaggeration. The British government systematically manufactured narcotics, smuggled them into a foreign country, and then invaded that country when it tried to stop the flow. And they did it all to balance the books. The machine of empire ran on money, and by the early 19th century, that machine was sputtering toward bankruptcy. The fuel crisis was not oil or coal, it was tea. The British public had developed an addiction to Chinese tea that was pathological in its intensity. Every factory worker needed it to survive the 14-hour shifts in the textile mills. Every aristocrat needed it for their afternoon rituals. The government needed it because the import taxes on tea funded a significant portion of the state budget. Tea was not a luxury. It was the operational lifeblood of the entire British economic system. But there was a catastrophic problem with this arrangement. China had tea, and Britain had nothing China wanted in return. The Qing emperors sat in Beijing surrounded by silk, porcelain, and jade that made British wool look like garbage. Chinese astronomers had been mapping the heavens for centuries while Europeans were still burning witches. The emperor made his position brutally clear to British merchants. He would sell them tea, but he would only accept payment in silver. Nothing else. No negotiation. Just silver. For decades, the silver hemorrhaged out of Britain like blood from an open wound. Ships left London loaded with millions of ounces of precious metal and returned with nothing but dried leaves. The trade deficit was an existential threat to the Bank of England. The currency was destabilizing. The reserves were evaporating. If the flow of silver continued, the empire would collapse under the weight of its own debt. The directors of the East India Company stared at their ledgers and realized they needed a product that could reverse the flow. They needed something the Chinese could not refuse. They found opium, and they did not stumble into the drug trade by accident. They industrialized it. In the fertile plains of Bengal, the British colonial government established a narcotics production monopoly that would make modern cartels look like amateurs. They forced Indian farmers at gunpoint to tear out their food crops and plant endless fields of poppies. The processing facilities at Patna and Gazipur were not hidden jungle labs. They were government-run factories that operated with the efficiency of any other state enterprise. Visitors to the Gazipur opium factory described a scene that still defies belief. They walked into massive warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with earthen jars, each one filled with thick black opium paste. The smell was overwhelming, a sickeningly sweet odor that clung to your clothes and hair. Thousands of workers stood waist-deep in the drug, stirring it in enormous vats to ensure consistent potency. The British applied the same quality control standards to narcotics that they applied to steel or textiles. Each ball of opium was standardized in size and weight. Each cake was stamped with the official seal of the East India Company. This was not a criminal operation. This was a state-sponsored product. But the British government faced a legal problem that required creative accounting. Opium was strictly illegal in China, and the penalty for trafficking was death by strangulation. The British could not be seen directly violating Chinese sovereignty, so they created a system of plausible deniability that was brilliant in its cynicism. The East India Company did not ship the opium to China themselves. Instead, they held public auctions in Calcutta, where private merchants could buy the government-manufactured drugs. These merchants were the smugglers, the distributors, the street-level dealers in an operation that stretched across the Pacific. Men like William Jardine understood the economics of addiction better than any modern business school graduate. Jardine was a Scottish physician who had abandoned medicine for something far more profitable. He bought opium at the Calcutta auctions, loaded it onto fast clipper ships armed with cannons, and sailed them to the Pearl River Delta. There his ships anchored offshore and transformed into floating drug warehouses. He bribed Chinese officials. He armed local gangs. He built a distribution network that moved British opium from the decks of ships into the veins of Chinese citizens, and the silver came flooding back across the Pacific into British banks. The plan worked with terrifying efficiency. The silver that Britain paid for tea was recaptured by the opium trade and deposited back into the imperial treasury. The trade deficit evaporated. The Bank of England stabilized. The empire was saved. But the cost was the systematic destruction of Chinese society. By 1838, British smugglers were moving 40,000 chests of opium into China every year. That is roughly 5 million pounds of pure narcotic. Think about the scale of that. 5 million pounds of addictive poison flooding into a single country in a single year. The impact was apocalyptic. Chinese officials sent reports to Beijing describing entire villages where the men had stopped working because they spent their days on wooden pallets smoking opium. The imperial army was rotting from within because soldiers sold their weapons to buy drugs. The bureaucracy was paralyzed because the magistrates were high. The silver that formed the backbone of the Chinese economy was vanishing, drained away to pay for British poison. Inflation spiraled. Famines erupted. The Qing emperor watched his empire disintegrate, not from military invasion, but from biological warfare disguised as free trade. In 1839, the emperor made a desperate decision. He appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with orders to destroy the opium trade by any means necessary. Lin Zexu was known as Blue Sky Lin because his integrity was considered as clear as the heavens. He was one of the few officials in China who could not be bribed. He arrived in Canton in March of 1839, and he did not come to negotiate. He came to wage war on the cartel. He arrested thousands of Chinese dealers and threw them into prisons. He rounded up tens of thousands of addicts and forced them into brutal rehabilitation programs. But Lin knew that arresting the victims was pointless. He had to cut off the supply. He issued an ultimatum to the British merchants living in the foreign quarter of Canton. Surrender every ounce of opium in your possession and sign a bond promising never to smuggle drugs again. When the British tried to stall, Lin deployed troops to surround their compound. He cut off their food and water. He ordered soldiers to beat drums and gongs all night, denying them sleep. He turned their luxury trading post into a prison. The British superintendent, Captain Charles Elliot, realized he had lost. He ordered the merchants to surrender their opium and promised them that Queen Victoria herself would reimburse them for their losses. It was a promise that would lead to war. Lin Zexu seized over 20,000 chests of British opium. This was a mountain of drugs worth millions of dollars. He did not sell it. He did not redistribute it. He ordered massive trenches dug on the beach at Hummun. The opium was crushed and thrown into the trenches, then mixed with lime and salt. The chemical reaction caused the mixture to boil and hiss, turning the narcotic into toxic sludge. Then, at low tide, Lin opened the sluice gates and washed the poison into the sea. It took 23 days to destroy it all. While the opium burned, Lin sat in his tent and wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. It is one of the most devastating documents in diplomatic history. He wrote to her not as a barbarian to a civilized monarch, but as one human being to another. He asked her a simple question that still echoes through time. I am told that in your own country opium smoking is forbidden. How then can you bear to let it poison other lands? He assumed she would see reason. He assumed she shared his values. He was catastrophically wrong. The letter was never answered. We do not know if Victoria ever read it. But in London, the destruction of the opium was not seen as law enforcement. It was seen as theft of British property. When news reached the city of London, the drug smugglers did not hide in shame. They launched a lobbying campaign. William Jardine traveled to London and met with Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston. He unrolled maps of the Chinese coast and pointed to defenseless harbors. He argued that the Chinese had insulted the British flag and violated the sacred principles of free trade. He promised that a small fleet of modern warships could bring China to its knees in weeks. The British government faced a choice. They could accept the loss and respect Chinese sovereignty, or they could go to war to force China to pay for the destroyed drugs. They looked at their ledgers. They looked at the $20 million bill from the opium merchants. They looked at their empty treasury. They chose war. The decision was not made by generals or diplomats. It was made by accountants who realized that war was cheaper than bankruptcy. The fleet that sailed from India in the summer of 1840 was not a military expedition. It was a debt collection agency backed by industrial firepower. At the head of the armada was a ship called Nemesis. It was the first ocean-going iron warship in history, powered by steam engines that let it sail against wind and up shallow rivers. To the Chinese defenders watching from the shore, it must have looked like a demon from hell. Their own navy consisted of wooden junks with cannons that had not changed since the Ming Dynasty. The collision between these forces was not a battle. It was a massacre. The British strategy was simple and ruthless. They did not try to conquer China's interior. They strangled it. They sailed up the coast, bombarding forts and seizing ports. They captured the grain barges that carried food to Beijing, threatening the capital with starvation. Chinese generals were brave men who had studied war their entire lives, but they were fighting technology they could not comprehend. Their cannonballs bounced off the iron hull of Nemesis. Their wooden ships were incinerated by explosive rockets. British officers watched Chinese soldiers stand their ground and fire their matchlocks until they were cut down by grape shot. It was the medieval world colliding with the industrial age. and the industrial age had no mercy. By the summer of 1842, the British fleet had sailed up the Yangtze River and aimed their guns at Nanjing. They threatened to burn the city to ashes if the emperor did not surrender. Faced with annihilation, the emperor capitulated. On August 29, 1842, Chinese officials boarded the HMS Cornwallis and signed the Treaty of Nanking. The Chinese call it the first of the unequal treaties. That is an understatement. It was a financial execution. The terms were dictated by force and designed to strip China of economic sovereignty. China was ordered to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. 6 million of those dollars were specifically earmarked to reimburse the British for the opium that Lin Zixu had destroyed. Let that sink in for a moment. The British government forced China to pay for the drugs that had been smuggled into their country illegally. It was a protection racket executed at the level of international diplomacy. But the money was only part of the price. The treaty forced China to open 5 treaty ports where British merchants could operate outside Chinese law. And most significantly, it forced the emperor to cede a barren island off the southern coast to the British crown in perpetuity. That island was Hong Kong. Lord Palmerston was initially furious about Hong Kong. He called it a barren rock with hardly a house upon it. He wanted productive territory, not a desolate fishing village. But the drug smugglers understood what the politicians did not. Hong Kong was the prize. It was a perfect safe haven. Under the protection of the British flag, the opium traders could build warehouses and dock their ships without fear of Chinese authorities. Hong Kong became the headquarters of the cartel. It was a logistical hub from which poison flowed into the mainland. In the years after the treaty, the opium trade did not just resume. It exploded. British production facilities in India ramped up output to meet demand. By the 1880s, Britain was selling over 6,000 tons of opium to China every year. The revenue from this trade became the financial backbone of British rule in India. It paid for railways. It paid for the civil service. It paid for the navy that enforced Pax Britannica across the globe. The era of British peace and prosperity was underwritten by the addiction of millions of Chinese peasants. This is the truth that was airbrushed out of history books. The psychological damage to China was even worse than the economic cost. For thousands of years, China had viewed itself as the center of civilization. Now it had been humiliated by a nation of drug pushers. This trauma gave birth to what is known today as the Century of Humiliation. It was a period of chaos, civil war, and foreign domination that lasted until the mid-20th century. It is the wound that defines modern China. When Chinese leaders today speak of national rejuvenation or warn against foreign interference, they are not using abstract rhetoric. They are remembering the smoking pits at Hummun. They are remembering the British gunboats on the Yangtze. They are remembering the time when the West arrived not with open hands, but with closed fists full of poison. Sovereignty is solvency. Once you lose control of your economy, you lose control of everything. China learned that lesson in blood and silver. But what happened to the men who orchestrated this crime? Did William Jardine face justice for the misery he profited from? On the contrary, he returned to London a hero. He was elected to Parliament. His partner James Matheson became a baronet and one of the largest landowners in Britain. The company they founded, Jardine Matheson and Company, did not vanish into the shadows. It evolved. It moved from opium into shipping, real estate, and finance. It became one of the great trading houses that built modern Hong Kong. If you walk through Hong Kong's financial district today, you will see the legacy written in steel and glass. You will see Jardine House with its distinctive round windows looking out over Victoria Harbor. You will see streets named after the smugglers. The glittering prosperity of one of the world's greatest financial centers is built on a foundation of narcotics money. The concrete in the skyscrapers was mixed with silver drained from a dying empire. This is not ancient history. This is the blueprint. There is a strange irony in how the story ended. By the early 20th century, the British Empire eventually turned against the opium trade. Moral crusaders and religious groups in England gained enough political power to force the government to stop the exports. But they did not stop because they found a conscience. They stopped because it was no longer profitable. The empire had found other ways to extract wealth. The damage was already done. China had been bled dry for nearly a century. The Opium Wars prove a simple truth that still governs the world today. The line between a legitimate government and a criminal enterprise is just a matter of who has the bigger navy. Free trade is a noble concept that can be weaponized into a tool of exploitation. And when you control the ledger, you control the narrative. The British did not see themselves as drug dealers. They saw themselves as champions of commerce fighting against Chinese protectionism. They wrote the history books. They built the museums. They hung the portraits. Queen Victoria sat on her throne for 63 years as a symbol of virtue and grace. But the jewels in her crown were polished with silver extracted from a collapsing civilization. The tea in her cup was steeped in the suffering of millions. The Industrial Revolution that powered Britain into the modern age was funded in part by narcotics revenue. This is the hidden engine of empire. This is the balance sheet behind the grandeur. The ghosts of the opium dens have not vanished. They linger in the suspicion that still colors relations between East and West. They linger in the memory of every developing nation that was told to open its markets or face consequences. They remind us that sovereignty is not a birthright. It is a privilege that can be stripped away by anyone with superior firepower and a product to sell. And once you force a nation to swallow your poison, you can never expect them to trust you when you offer them medicine.